when Western journalists in both print media and television inform us about Africa. As you may know, they target their big five: ethnic fighting, corruption, HIV/AIDS, poverty, and starvation. Yes, and even some scholars, not all of them of course, go with their biases to portray Africa in their own words. Africa has so much to offer the world, and given that one way or another we all trace our genetic material, our mitochondria, to the continent, so scientists say, we should hold it very dear to us all. Our shared history of origin suggests that we need to work together for the betterment of humanity. We must move Africa from the periphery to the center stage. As you probably are aware now, outsiders' knowledge of Africa is scant, despite vast resources available to teach and learn about the 54 independent nations. And despite over 400 years of human and natural contact with those outside the continent, and this is in spite of exponential changes in communication technologies. The invitation extended to me by the African Studies Program and the recognition granted by the Institute of the African Child, the African Student Union, Ohio University, serve as some of the most critical ways that we can share and exchange information about Africa. In particular, the information about sport developments in pre-colonial Africa and the post-colonial condition as it impacts participation of Africans in their play game forms and sport competitions. Essentially, Africa under the European reign had far-reaching ramifications for people's play games and sports. In general, though, indigenous African games were actually discontinued by the colonial activity according to Salflasty, 1973. Transition from indigenous traditions to sports in post-colonial situations has been that sports that Africans shared with Europe were preserved. In Kenya, for instance, the coming of the Europeans and their settlements in many parts of Kenya led to a loss of many activities for the people. The post-colonial period in Africa, which is referring to the period following independence. In the context of this paper, post-colonialism concerns happenings and experiences that characterize sport and physical activity developments in the continent of Africa. The post-colonial era in Africa, according to Ali Masrui, the famous African historian, is made up of triple heritages: Islamic, indigenous, and Western. The concept of triple play of cultures is representative of Africa's experience in sport in the post-colonial era. Of the colonial system, though, the British educational system allowed Anglophone Africans to succeed in international sports, more so than Francophone Africa south of Sahara. Indigenous Africa, as currently observed, is more responsive to sports and physical activity developments in the society than in Islamic and formerly European-ruled African nations. For positive changes to be firmly rooted in the continent, indigenous structures of sports need to be developed and expanded for all in Africa. And African nations focused on changes associated with sport developments must recognize possessors of indigenous knowledge as they play a critical part in cultural preservation. Contrary to Western media's perspectives of Africa, our big five ought to be diversity, hospitality, work ethic, complexity, and harmony. Why diversity? For Africa is truly different, whichever you look at, geography, language. In Kenya alone, we have over 42 different ethnic groups. Although my friend Nana has said they should be called nations, and I'll borrow that term. Hospitality, for we are truly unquestionably happy people, for we share all that we have at any time. You go to a village in Africa, they won't know you from being. They will say, come in, they will cook the only chicken they have, and the man or woman, they will leave your house to the visitors and they'll go away. If you go there eating, they'll give you their food, you share with them. So hospitality, we really truly are hospitable. Work ethic, for we work hard to sustain our family's livelihood and the society at large. Harmony, for we are relatively a calm continent, considering the ethnic group, over 100 different nations in Nigeria alone. So, considering the continent, we are relatively calm. And complexity, because the continent is multifaceted with cultures dating back several centuries. Despite the many difficulties that face Africa and continue to face the continent, many Africans still stand tall, fighting to preserve all that is human, challenging the human condition, and trying to preserve Africa, the beauty of the continent, and restoring Africa to its former glory. When our beloved continent, Africa, is truly free to share its indigenous heritage, to engage fully in global sports, and to enjoy the art of movement, to share the sport revenues, to uplift our economic conditions, to change our lives and live up to our dreams. And yes, enjoy the rhythms of movement that punctuate lives in the continent. Then you and I can share the laughter, can join in the drumming, can join in the dance, to share the poetry of movement that serves as the heartbeat of the continent. Thank you.
The name of my presentation today was Playing for Peace, Changing Perceptions, Bridging Divides, and Developing Leaders. And it kind of encapsulates our three-pronged approach for using basketball as a tool to get young children, boys and girls of different ethnicities, different races playing basketball together. Currently we have 60 young South African men and women who are training as coaches and conflict mediators to work with these children and to teach them our very intensive and extensive life skills curriculum program. We are working with the Harvard School of Public Health that has helped us create this life skills program that's teaching the young men and women about HIV and AIDS prevention in South Africa.
My paper is entitled Figures and Display, the Interplay of Sports with Aesthetics and Youth in Africa. And it is examining the interaction between sports and aesthetics in African literature. And we're going to insert elements of peace and reconciliation, because this session is on that topic. The artist is using sports to draw the attention of the reader and construct meanings. And by presenting this excited audience in the text, the artist is trying to create some intersubjective connection with the reader as well, so that the very process of bringing out the text captures the need for negotiation between various categories in the society.
Presentation objective was to show how sports have been used as an instrument in peace and reconciliation. Secondly, how sports have been used to build political constituency and legitimacy. And finally, the overall success of sports program in Rwanda after genocide until the recent participation of Rwandan football team in the African Nations Cup finals. Looking at the overall success of the sports program in Rwanda, you can hope that at long run, the sports program in Rwanda give a hope and proof that sports are contributing to rebuild the country and to reconcile people in Rwanda.
In the summer of 2003, when the fighting in Monrovia escalated, there were 21,000 soldiers under the age of 18. They were both men, girls, and boys. And in the UN's plan for disarmament, there are a total of 40,000 ex-combatants. So over 50% of the combatants in the fighting were under the age of 18. Don Bosco Homes is an orphanage just outside of Monrovia that uses football, other games, as a way to get kids back into the process of just talking to each other and figuring out ways to take the guns away from kids, to get them off the drugs that they were many times given in order to be able to fight, and getting them into a home or a school, something where they can learn a trade, is key to being able to develop a functioning civil society and a functioning democracy in Liberia.
My topic for this conference was looking at the whole idea of satellite television, Ugandans and the British Premier League Soccer, basically looking at the divisions of the alliances of soccer fans between two major clubs, that is Manchester United and Arsenal. So at the end of the day, basically what I end up pointing out is that, you know, probably these alliances and, you know, and die-hard dedication to these teams actually represent some sort of, you know, nationality, and by nationality loosely defined, in the sense of that their allegiances to these teams that tend to represent the very core of what it means for them to be human beings. Now the downside of it is that local football has suffered as a result. So fewer people are going to watch the game in the stadium, you know, and they would rather watch it on TV. And the explanation that the most logical explanation I think I can come up with is that the marketing of British football has been quite persistent and very well done. And that in a nutshell is sort of my presentation.
Presenting today on the representation of African athletes in Western media. Specifically, I'm interested in comparing the images or stereotypes of Africans from the continent, the US, and Latin America and the Caribbean, and also Canada, to see what parallels there are in terms of these representations, in terms of the history of those representations, and in terms of how, as a people or race, Africans are continued to be seen by media, particularly Western media, in a certain light. When examining these images over a period of time, you can still see very clearly that Africans are considered to be one step removed from the animal kingdom, savages, brutes. Particularly, this is emphasized over and over again when there is an incident in media, when an athlete, particularly in the United States, an African American, or even internationally, in Ben Johnson's case, in the 1988 Olympics, these incidents are always more focused by the media, and you have more coverage from the media because they perceive these images and these events to be newsworthy. And it's always asked exactly why do they have to select certain images, ones that continue to perpetuate the stereotypes about Africans.
When I talk about cricket, I'm not just talking about how the game of cricket is played. What I'm talking about is the way cricket is contested, the struggle for power that occurs within cricket, and the resistance that occurs within cricket. My research looks at Calypso and how Calypso articulates the politics behind cricket. Through different resistance movements, you find that the cricket team has moved from one where it was all white to one in which the team is all black. Simply put, Calypso is the mouthpiece of the Caribbean people, and Calypsonians are the griots of Caribbean societies. What I found is that one, contrary to the belief that people were so taken away with the mindset of the colonials, this is not true. Caribbean people are not passive. They have been critically thinking and reflecting on their world. And the next thing is there is a need to re-examine the whole concept of hegemony.
Maraboutage is a word from French that the French gave to African marabouts who practice certain magic in the society. The magic lead them just to see, to have power, with the power that can help them to change, ameliorate, prevent, and destroy situations. So, but in that topic, I try to raise different points and questions so that why do we need maraboutage in sport? How does maraboutage affect sport? What are the problems and what are the possible solutions? One thing was the possibilities for us just to really find a solution to the situation that's really discouraging a young teenager to believe in themselves, their own competence, their own strength, and just to not believe in hard work just to succeed in life.
What I have presented is an outline of elements that are in existence in the United States, Canada, Mexico, and elsewhere around the globe that enable people to offer programs in sport, recreation, physical education, and dance for children. I have presented questions for people. I haven't provided any answers, but I've provided a lot of questions for these people to roll through in their own mind so that they can come to grips with what might be possible in their area, in their state, in their region, in their country, on the continent.
Basically, what is happening is that they use metaphors of art and science to describe themselves and Africans and Europeans. And when they talk about art, they posit art as something positive and look upon science, which they identify with Europeans, as something negative. So in this way, they are basically inverting the usual talk of Europeans, of Western ways of talking about Africans. At the end of the paper, I basically argue that these dualistic discourses, whether they are turned upside down or not, are just that. They are essentialist arguments, and very clearly people in their real lives live in both worlds and draw upon both sides of the equation. Thank you.
My topic today was sport in Africa, a potential tool for community empowerment. Why I choose that topic is that because I believe to a certain extent for development to occur in Africa, we need to focus on the community. I believe that instead of, for instance, spending millions for the soccer team, of the national soccer team of a country, you can use part of that money to reinvest in at the community level and make some facilities that are affordable and available all time to the youngsters. And also sport is interested by all group ages, especially the youngsters who usually are looking for employment and education.
Yes with Africa is the Youth Education and Sports Program, which is a program focusing on the education and development of young leaders in West Africa between the ages of 7 to about 19. We have focused on the use of sports as a means for helping to develop young leaders, with basketball being our priority. We feel that it's very important that we focus on the leadership development opportunities with young people, and that sports is a means for facilitating this development. We are also, with that model, attempting to build self-reliance into it with cyber centers that will be built in each of the countries, and agricultural development projects that will help to sustain it long term. And we look forward to continuing the challenge of working with our collaborators on the continent in the future.
Basically, the presentation highlights the fact that very often athletes or sportsmen and women are left out of the problem-solving process. That when the sport is in trouble and you're trying to figure out a way to get around it, we very often leave out the sportsmen and women. And so this is to highlight how Ghanaian athletes, basically through collaboration with a lot of many different groups, help actually save the sport. I'm going to highlight some of the problems that we faced prior to the initiative by the athletes and how we dealt with those problems, some of the problems we are still facing, and from there go on and talk about some of the results we've achieved since our initiative. So basically that would be the whole presentation, that athletes can make a difference, and that difference can come, or at least the approach that worked for us was to approach it, take the direction of collaboration with other groups.
In the recent past, we've seen the deterioration of athletics in Africa, and two, we are also seeing a lot of our athletes being taken or changing the country allegiances. The first thing that always comes to our minds is that, okay, where are we going to get the resources to do all these kinds of things? We are already very fragmented. How are we going to pull ourselves together to ensure that we have that joint fund that would help in the development of sport in Africa? Thank you.
Our study, we're doing a review of the sports administration management practices, a qualitative review of the sports administrative and management practices for Nigeria and for Cameroon. And basically in our study we have 5 major areas that we're looking at. We're looking at the administrative and management practices, we're looking at the laws and regulations governing the sports programs in Nigeria and Cameroon. We're examining the organizational finances, and then how resources are generated. We're also examining the marketing and promotions practices of the international, national, state level, and local level programs. And with that, we get to our last area, which is athlete development. Right now, we're, as I said, collecting the data, and people have access to our survey. If they have access to the internet, then they can get it through the internet. But we've also hired emissaries to go out around Nigeria and to Cameroon and around Cameroon to take our surveys out to athletes, to sports officials, to administrators in the country, in each of those countries, and actually give them a hard copy of the survey to fill out and take it back.
Basically, I'm looking at how the government of Zimbabwe has taken upon itself to sponsor the sport of soccer, and also the administration in times when the responsible board, the Zimbabwe Football Association, could not afford to send especially national teams to continental games. The crux of the matter is that the government of Zimbabwe's involvement in sport since independence in 1980 has not been impressive. It is only now, when there is an economic and political crisis, that it wanted to associate itself with a winning team. Because, you know, sports mobilize people of different political affiliations, age, sex, even nationality itself. So to me, I don't see the government's involvement in sports, especially soccer, as a philanthropic move, but as a way of trying to gain support of the people who are disgruntled by the mismanagement of the economy.
The main point to be made was, with all the discussions about how Islam presumably inhibits women from participating in public life, I wanted to argue that in general, you know, Islam is not per se a block to women's participation, but rather you'd have to look at Islam, the practice of Islam, the lived experience of people in communities, and how they brought together all these different elements, which include Islam and colonial experiences and the political economy, to see how it affected sporting opportunities. But when you scratch below the surface, it's more of a cultural a cultural notion that somehow sports will, the practice of sports, the practice of this kind of physical activity, will undermine a woman's femininity. In other parts of Africa, in northern Nigeria, Islam is particularly used as a way to prohibit girls from participating in some sports. So I think ultimately you have to look at the very specific local and historical circumstance that is the sort of pot that Islam is part of, to determine the effect that Islam might have on gender, on how women participate in the sports and how men participate in the sports.
I try to look at the reason why girls are not participating in sport, and I mostly try to debunk Islam as a barrier to girls' participation in Guinea, and I try to find out, to show that the same reason that are preventing girls from participating in education are the one also that are preventing them from participating in sport.
What I did is I looked at Zulu and Xhosa stick fighting, and I talked about how young people in particular played a very important role in sustaining indigenous sporting traditions in pre-colonial Africa. And how did they do this? They did this in a number of ways, and primarily by operating independently of adults. A lot of the leisure that I talk about really operated in a space that was run by young people. Now, adults played some role at different times, but it's this idea that stick fighting was our game that really is so critical, because what's fun about it, right, for African youth, is that it's our game. It's not our parents' games. It's not our relatives' games. It's not our neighbor's game. It's our game. And it was also young people who had such a critical role in making sports like football, boxing, track and field, and so on, into an avenue of pleasure, into a space that was free, relatively free, in a context of dire poverty and political exploitation.
I talked a little about the physical characteristics of a lot of the Kenyan elite distance runners who have been tested, and there is really no conclusive evidence that there are physical characteristics that contribute to their superiority, while they are different than many other distance runners around the world. They also tend to be the same to some degree. So what is the secret to their success? From a sociological perspective, it's been suggested that they want it worse than others. They are mentally tough. those who have studied their training believe that they train at such high thresholds that it contributes majorly to their dominance. So it's all of those things together. We don't know what makes them the world's best runners, but they are.
In the day and a half that we've been together, we're talking about, in addition to the 4 presenters here, many other diverse array of presenters who have given an engaging dialogue dealing with the examination of the relationship between sports and politics, sports and culture, sports and gender, sports and conflict, sports and the media, sports and development. Incredible job. We're opening up to the audience, opening up to you, and your job is to make comments on great practices programs that you've heard about in this symposium or from your travels, from your experience. Or you can direct questions to the panel. But really we want to hear from you because we're wrapping this up. Time is running out and we want to hear from the audience.
If you're using sports in development, that's a slower process, because it means going into communities, establishing partnerships, and that takes a long time. And when you look at at least, in some places, there's a 4-year turnaround in terms of the political environment. I mean, how do you deal with that? How do you get, politicians, leaders to understand that?
The question should be, how can we use in a situation where the elite athlete or elite sports is what is available to us, how can we use that to the advantage, to our advantage? How can we get it to draw in more people if participation is your goal, or if whatever your goal is, just extend it to the masses?
Part of this notion of praxis is that those of us in the academy, who work in the academy, have a responsibility to bring legitimacy to the discussion of these kinds of issues, as well as the work that we are doing and that we feel is important.